Racist judge sentences black mother to life in prison, unaware her husband is the mayor. Angela had always been the kind of woman who lived a simple but meaningful life. She worked hard at her job, cared deeply for her young son, and tried her best to stay out of trouble. Her days were filled with early mornings preparing breakfast, rushing to work, and late evenings making sure her child did his homework before bed. People in her neighborhood knew her as kind-hearted, responsible, and strong. She never imagined that one small misunderstanding could change her life so dramatically. It all started one morning when she was driving to the grocery store. She had promised her son that she would bake his favorite chocolate cake after school, so she wanted to make sure everything was ready. On the way, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She pulled over, confused but calm. A police officer approached her car, his face stern and unfriendly. He asked her to step out. Angela obeyed, not wanting to create any problem. The officer told her that her car matched the description of a vehicle involved in a theft earlier that week. Angela was shocked. She tried to explain that she had been at work, and she had proof, but the officer didn't seem interested in hearing her. Before she realized what was happening, she was handcuffed and taken to the station. Angela kept repeating that there must be a mistake, but no one seemed to listen. She thought it would all be cleared up quickly, that the truth would come out once they checked her alibi. She had clocked in at work and had co-workers who could confirm her presence. But hours passed, and the fear inside her grew. She worried about her son, who was waiting at school for her to pick him up. Days later, she was still in custody. What should have been a simple misunderstanding was turning into something much bigger. Angela was finally told that her case would go to trial. She felt like the ground beneath her feet was slipping away. How could this happen to someone who had never broken the law, someone who spent her days working and caring for her family? She prayed that when she stood before a judge, fairness would prevail. She believed in justice, even though she was beginning to feel the system was cold and distant. The day of the trial arrived. Angela walked into the courtroom, her wrists aching from the cold metal of the handcuffs. Her heart pounded as she looked around. The room was filled with people, lawyers, police officers, curious onlookers, and a few reporters scribbling in their notepads. At the back of the room, her young son sat with a neighbor who had agreed to care for him during this time. His innocent eyes were full of worry, and Angela forced herself to smile at him, even though her heart was breaking inside. When Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, the atmosphere changed. He was a tall man with a stern face, and he carried himself with authority. Everyone rose to their feet, but Angela noticed the way his eyes narrowed when he looked at her. It was as if he had already made up his mind before the trial even began. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered like a heavy cloud. The prosecutor spoke with confidence, painting Angela as someone dangerous, someone who should be punished. He used words that twisted the story, making her look guilty. Angela's lawyer tried to defend her, pointing out that she had no criminal record, that she was at work when the incident took place, and that there was no solid proof tying her to the crime. But every time her lawyer spoke, Judge Harrison interrupted. His tone was sharp, almost impatient, as if he didn't want to hear anything that could prove her innocence. Angela sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but her lawyer advised her to stay calm. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing on her. She glanced back at her son again. He was fidgeting, his small hands clutching the edge of the wooden bench. Seeing him gave her strength. No matter what, she had to stay composed for him. As the trial continued, it became clear to everyone watching that the judge was not giving Angela a fair chance. Evidence that could help her case was dismissed quickly. Witnesses who might prove her innocence were not given enough time to speak. Angela felt as if she were trapped in a game where the rules were already set against her. Her heart sank deeper with every passing hour. Despite the unfairness, Angela held her head high. She reminded herself that she was innocent, that truth always had a way of coming out. She thought of her husband, who had been busy with work commitments and could not be present yet. She knew he believed in her completely. She whispered a silent prayer that he would arrive before things spiraled further out of control. The tension in the courtroom was heavy. Even some of the jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, noticing how unbalanced the trial seemed. Reporters exchanged glances, scribbling notes that captured the unfair treatment Angela was receiving. Yet no one dared to speak openly against the judge's behavior. His authority was unquestioned, and his reputation for being harsh was well known. By the end of the day, Angela was exhausted. She felt as if she had lived a year in those few hours. Still, she kept her dignity. She walked out of the courtroom slowly, her eyes forward, even as whispers followed her. People could see the injustice, but she refused to let their pity weaken her spirit. She knew this was only the beginning of a fight that she never asked for but had to face. That night, in her cell, Angela thought of her son's face, the way his eyes filled with tears when he saw her led away. She thought of her husband, the one person she trusted most, and wished he could be by her side. She held on to hope, even though fear tugged at her heart. She reminded herself that no storm lasts forever, and that even in the darkest hours, light can find its way through. The first part of her story was not just about being accused of something she hadn't done, it was about standing in front of a system that seemed determined to break her. It was about keeping her dignity when everything around her was trying to strip it away. Angela knew she had to endure whatever was coming, not only for herself but for her son, who needed her strength. And though the judge believed he had the power to control her fate, Angela held onto a quiet truth: her life was bigger than this one moment, and her story was far from over. Angela sat quietly as the second day in court began, her heart heavy but her spirit still holding on. She tried to appear calm, though inside her chest a storm raged. She had barely slept the night before, her mind replaying the trial over and over. Every unfair interruption from the judge, every dismissive look, every moment she felt silenced, it all came back to her. Yet she walked into the courtroom with her chin lifted, refusing to show fear. She told herself that if she could stand tall, maybe her son watching from the back would believe that everything would be all right. The room felt even more tense than before. Whispers filled the air as people filed into their seats. Reporters arranged their notepads, waiting for the day's drama to unfold. Angela's son sat quietly beside the neighbor again, his small face pale with worry. She wanted so badly to run over and hug him, to promise him that nothing would take her away forever. But she was forced to sit silently between guards, her wrists stiff from the cuffs. Judge Harrison entered with the same stern expression, his robe swaying as he took his place. His gaze swept the room, but when it landed on Angela, his lips pressed into a thin line. It was as if he had already decided what the outcome of this case would be, and nothing, no facts, no truth could change his mind. The prosecutor stood and began to speak. His words painted Angela as someone who could not be trusted, someone capable of things she would never even imagine. He used strong, cold language that cut like glass, and though the evidence was weak, his confidence filled the room. Angela's lawyer tried to object, but once again, Judge Harrison shut him down. "Move on," the judge said sharply. "The facts speak for themselves." Angela's heart sank. What facts? There were none. She wanted to shout that she had been at work, that people could prove it, that cameras at her office building would show her walking in and out that day. But every time her lawyer tried to bring this up, the judge brushed it aside, saying it was not relevant. How could her very alibi not be relevant? It felt like a cruel play, where the ending had already been written before the actors even walked onto the stage. As the hours passed, Angela's shoulders grew heavier. She could see the jurors shifting in their seats, some glancing at her with sympathy, others looking uncertain. Even they seemed uncomfortable with the way the trial was going. Yet they, too, were under the judge's authority, and his sharp instructions left little room for doubt. Finally, the moment came when Judge Harrison leaned forward, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "Angela," he said, his tone cold and final, "based on the evidence presented and the circumstances of this case, this court finds you guilty." Angela's breath caught in her throat. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the prosecutor blinked in surprise at how quickly the judgment had been delivered. Her lawyer stood frozen, his mouth open, unable to believe that the verdict had come without a fair fight. And then, the words that shook everyone in the room, "The sentence is life in prison." Gasps filled the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, some dropping their pens in shock. The neighbor sitting with Angela's son placed a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The little boy, too young to fully understand but old enough to feel the weight of the moment, burst into tears. His cries echoed in the silent courtroom, breaking Angela's heart in ways words could not describe. Angela's chest tightened. Life in prison? For something she had not even done? It felt like the ground beneath her had shattered. She looked at her lawyer, who shook his head in disbelief, whispering that he would appeal. But appeals would take time away from her son, time stolen from her life. She turned her eyes to the judge. His expression was one of satisfaction, as though he had proven a point. He didn't look at her as a person, a mother, or a human being. He looked at her as if she were nothing more than a name on a file. The guards moved closer, ready to lead her away. Angela's body trembled, but she straightened her back. She would not let them see her break. She turned her head toward her son, meeting his tear-filled eyes. With the softest smile she could manage, she mouthed the words, "It's okay." He shook his head, crying harder, but she held his gaze until the guards pulled her forward. The weight of the sentence hung in the air long after she was taken out of the room. People in the courtroom began to murmur loudly, some shaking their heads, others whispering to reporters. Even those who did not know Angela personally could see the injustice. A few jurors exchanged troubled looks, clearly uneasy with the outcome. But no one spoke against it. The judge's decision was final, at least for now. Angela was placed back in her cell that night, her heart aching in a way she had never known. She thought of her son, of the way his small hands reached out for her as she was led away. She thought of the life they had built together, of the promises she had made to always be there for him. And now, in one swift decision, all of it had been taken from her. She closed her eyes, letting silent tears roll down her cheeks. It wasn't just about the sentence. It was about the way she had been treated, ignored, dismissed, judged not by the truth of her actions but by assumptions she could not control. She wondered how many others had sat in this same position, powerless in the face of a system that refused to listen. And yet, even in her despair, Angela clung to hope. She knew her husband. She knew his heart, his strength, his belief in justice. He had not been there in the courtroom yet, but she trusted that when he found out what had happened, he would move mountains to make things right. She held onto that thought as tightly as she could, letting it be the small flame in the darkness of her cell. The world outside the courthouse was already buzzing with the story. Reporters wasted no time publishing headlines about the shocking sentence. Neighbors and strangers alike spoke in outrage, wondering how such a harsh punishment could be handed down with so little evidence. People debated in coffee shops, workplaces, and living rooms, their voices rising in anger at what they had seen. Inside her lonely cell, Angela could not hear their voices, but she felt in her heart that the truth would not stay hidden forever. She believed that light, no matter how small, always found a way to shine through even the darkest corners. And so, though her body was caged and her heart was heavy, she sat on the thin bed, whispering to herself the same promise she had mouthed to her son, "It's okay. This is not the end." She didn't know when or how, but deep inside, Angela knew her story was far from over. The day after the shocking sentence, Angela sat quietly in her cell. The room was small, the walls plain and gray, and the silence heavy. She thought of her son again, of his small hands pressed against his eyes as he cried in the courtroom. Her heart ached, but she tried to steady herself. She whispered prayers under her breath, asking for strength. She told herself that no matter how dark things seemed, truth always had a way of rising. Outside those walls, the city buzzed with talk about her case. Newspapers carried bold headlines, television anchors replayed clips from the trial, and social media exploded with outrage. Many people who had never met Angela were now speaking her name, calling her situation unjust and cruel. The image of a mother being sentenced to life in prison despite weak evidence spread quickly. Yet inside her cell, Angela had no idea of the storm gathering beyond the prison gates. The next court session was scheduled for the formal signing of the judgment. Angela was led back into the same courtroom, her wrists bound once again. She walked with quiet dignity, her chin raised though her spirit felt tired. The room was even more crowded than before, with more reporters, more curious citizens, and a heavier silence that seemed to hang over everyone present. People wanted to see what would happen next. Her son was there again, sitting with the kind neighbor. He looked smaller than ever, his shoulders slouched, his eyes swollen from tears. Angela smiled at him softly, though her own heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. She wanted him to see courage on her face, not despair. Judge Harrison entered, his robe swaying, his expression stern as ever. He did not glance at Angela with compassion. Instead, he carried the same air of finality, as though her fate was already sealed. He sat down, lifted a file, and prepared to proceed. Just as the room settled into silence, a calm but firm voice rose from the back. "Your Honor," it said, steady and clear. Every head in the courtroom turned. A tall man stepped forward, his posture strong, his face composed yet serious. His presence carried weight, a kind of quiet authority that filled the room even before he introduced himself. He was dressed neatly in a dark suit, his expression controlled but his eyes full of fire. Angela's breath caught. It was David, her husband. She hadn't expected him to arrive in this way, so suddenly, so boldly. Her eyes filled with tears, not of despair but of relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a spark of hope light inside her chest. The judge looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "And you are?" he asked in a clipped tone. The man stepped further into the room, his voice calm but unwavering. "David Carter. Husband of Angela Carter. And," he paused, his eyes sweeping across the stunned audience, "the elected mayor of the city." The room erupted in whispers, gasps, and the hurried scratching of reporters' pens. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every angle of the shocking revelation. People leaned toward one another, murmuring in disbelief. The mayor? The woman unfairly sentenced to life in prison was married to the mayor? Angela sat frozen, her eyes wide. She had always known her husband as her steady rock, the man who helped her son with homework, who held her hand through every storm. She was proud of his public service, but she had never sought attention for being his wife. They had kept their private life quiet to protect their family. And now, in this moment, their worlds had collided in the most dramatic way. Judge Harrison blinked, his face paling slightly, though he quickly tried to regain his composure. He cleared his throat, his voice sharp. "Mr. Carter, this is highly irregular. You cannot disrupt the court in this manner." David's calm did not falter. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the judge's. "What is irregular," he said firmly, "is sentencing a woman to life in prison without fair evidence. What is irregular is silencing her defense, dismissing her alibi, and treating her not as a citizen, but as if her fate was decided before she even walked into this courtroom." The murmurs grew louder. People nodded, their faces reflecting agreement. Even some jurors looked relieved that someone had spoken aloud the very thoughts they had been too afraid to express. Angela's chest swelled with emotion. She had felt so alone during the trial, so powerless. But now, with David standing there, his voice echoing with truth, she felt the balance of power begin to shift. Judge Harrison tried to maintain control. He tapped his gavel sharply. Order. This is a court of law, not a stage for politics. David did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the tension like steel. This is not politics, Judge. This is justice. And justice, in this city, will not be denied. Not while I serve its people. The reporters scribbled furiously, their pens unable to keep up with the pace of history being made before their eyes. Some even whispered to each other that this moment would change the course of the city's future. Angela lowered her head for a moment, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not tears of defeat, but tears of pride. She thought of the many times her husband had told her that fairness was worth fighting for, even when it was hard. Now she saw him proving it with every word. The judge shifted uncomfortably. His earlier arrogance seemed to waver under the weight of the mayor's presence. Yet he tried to reassert himself. Mr. Carter, you may speak as her husband, but your title as mayor holds no weight in this courtroom. David nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement. Then he replied, perhaps not in this courtroom. But outside these walls, my voice belongs to every citizen who demands fairness. And right now, the people are watching. The silence that followed was powerful. Everyone in the room could feel the truth in those words. The judge glanced at the rows of reporters, at the citizens whose eyes were locked on him, and at the mayor's unyielding expression. Angela's lawyer, who had felt so defeated earlier, now found new strength. He stood taller, his voice clearer as he addressed the court. Your Honor, in light of the mayor's statement and the overwhelming public concern, I demand this case be reviewed with proper attention to evidence. My client deserves a fair trial. More nods from the crowd, more whispers of agreement. The tide was turning. Angela looked at her husband again. His eyes softened when they met hers, and he gave her a small nod, a silent promise that he would not stop until she was free. In that moment, she felt her strength return. She was not alone. She had never been alone. The judge finally called for order and adjourned the session, his face tight with frustration. But the damage had already been done. His authority no longer felt untouchable. His decisions no longer seemed final. The truth had been spoken aloud, and it could not be silenced. As Angela was led back to her cell that evening, she felt something she had not felt in days, hope. Not just because her husband was powerful, but because he was courageous enough to stand for what was right. And she knew that beyond those prison walls, the world was beginning to rally behind her. The next chapter of her story had begun, not one of despair, but one of revelation. And it was only the beginning of the change that was about to unfold when the courtroom doors closed that day. The world outside burst wide open with noise. Reporters rushed from the building, microphones in hand, voices rising with urgency as they described what had just happened. Cameras flashed, vans lined the street, and live broadcasts began immediately. The news spread faster than wildfire. A black mother had been sentenced to life in prison on weak evidence, and her husband, the mayor, had confronted the judge in open court. It was a story that captured the attention of an entire city, and soon, the entire nation. Angela sat quietly in her cell, unaware of the waves her husband's words had caused. She knew people had been watching, but she didn't yet know how deeply her story had touched them. What she did know was that her heart felt lighter. For the first time in days, she had seen hope in action. David had stood up for her not just as her husband, but as a voice for justice. That memory kept her strong as the hours ticked by in silence. Outside, the public was not silent at all. Citizens filled parks, sidewalks, and courthouse steps, carrying signs with Angela's name. They chanted for fairness, for truth, and for justice. Some carried photos of her smiling with her son, showing the world that she was not a criminal, but a mother, a neighbor, a woman who deserved to be treated with dignity. Social media platforms were flooded with videos from the courtroom. Clips of the mayor's words were shared thousands of times, his calm but firm voice echoing across the internet. What is irregular is sentencing a woman to life in prison without fair evidence. People repeated those words like a rallying cry. At City Hall, David worked tirelessly. He answered questions from the press, met with community leaders, and spoke with organizations that had long been fighting for fair treatment in the justice system. He did not demand special treatment for Angela. Instead, he demanded fairness not just for her, but for anyone who had been ignored, dismissed, or silenced. His approach earned respect, even from those who usually disagreed with him politically. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison found himself under a spotlight he had never experienced before. For years, he had ruled his courtroom with unchecked authority. Few had dared to question him openly. But now, his name was on every news channel, every headline, and every social feed. Articles examined his past cases, digging into old files and rulings. Patterns began to emerge: cases where he had delivered unusually harsh sentences, cases where his judgment seemed influenced more by bias than by fact. Other families who had felt wronged by him began to speak out. One woman told a local paper how her brother had been given an unfair sentence years ago, despite evidence of his innocence. A man recalled how his appeal was dismissed without reason, leaving him behind bars for nearly a decade. These voices, once small and unheard, now grew louder, joining the chorus demanding accountability. Inside the courthouse, whispers turned into bold conversations. Lawyers who had once kept quiet admitted among themselves that they had long suspected the judge's prejudice. Now, with the public watching, even they began to speak more openly. His reputation, once untouchable, was crumbling. Angela's lawyer visited her in the cell to share the news. He leaned close, his face brighter than before. "Angela," he said softly, "people are speaking for you. The city is standing with you. Your case is not over." Angela pressed her hands together, her eyes closing as relief washed over her. She whispered, "Thank God." She thought of her son, of the moment when she could finally hold him again, and her heart swelled with determination. She knew the fight wasn't finished, but now she believed that the truth would find its way through. Day by day, the protests grew larger. Citizens marched peacefully through the streets, holding candles at night, chanting for change. News stations from across the country arrived, turning Angela's story into a national conversation. Panelists on talk shows debated the case, with many pointing out the clear unfairness of the trial. Her face, once unknown beyond her neighborhood, now appeared on screens everywhere, symbolizing resilience against injustice. Judge Harrison grew more defensive with each passing day. In one interview outside his home, he insisted that his ruling had been correct. But his words fell flat, and the video of him avoiding tough questions spread quickly. The more he tried to defend himself, the more the public turned against him. The city's legal board announced a review of his conduct, not only in Angela's case but across his entire career. This announcement made headlines. Reporters described it as the beginning of accountability, something rarely seen at such a level. The judge, once feared, now faced the possibility of suspension or even removal. Angela remained in her cell, but her spirit was no longer crushed. Letters poured in from strangers who believed in her, some sharing their own stories of being treated unfairly, others simply offering words of encouragement. The guards, once cold, began to treat her with more respect, aware of the attention surrounding her case. Even within those gray walls, she could feel the change. One evening, she was allowed a short call with her husband. His voice, steady and warm, filled her with strength. "Angela," he said, "this is not just about us anymore. People are listening. They see the truth now. Hold on a little longer. We're going to bring you home. She pressed the phone tightly to her ear, tears rolling down her cheeks, though her voice was firm. I trust you, she whispered. I trust us. And I believe God has a plan. The next morning, news broke that the state's attorney general had called for an independent investigation into her trial. The announcement sent shockwaves through the city. It meant that her case would not simply fade into the background. It meant someone outside the courtroom's walls was now looking closely at the details. The judge sat in his chambers that day, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His once proud posture slouched, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through papers. He knew the tide had turned. No matter how much he tried to defend himself, the truth had slipped beyond his control. His gavel, once a symbol of power, now felt heavy in his hand. Angela's story was no longer just hers, it was a movement. It was proof that when voices came together, even the most unshakable walls could begin to crumble. And as she sat on her bed that night, staring at the small window that let in a sliver of moonlight, Angela smiled softly for the first time since her arrest. She could almost feel the world shifting outside, bending slowly but surely toward justice. She whispered to herself, this storm will pass. And when it does, I'll walk out free, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been silenced. Her words floated into the quiet night, carried by faith and hope, unseen but powerful. And outside those walls, a city waited, determined to see the day she would walk free. The days that followed were unlike anything Angela had ever imagined. Her case, once a quiet trial buried in a courtroom, had become the talk of the entire nation. People she had never met spoke her name with compassion. Strangers carried signs with her picture, demanding her release. Families across the country saw in her story a reflection of their own struggles, of the times they had felt unheard or dismissed. Angela remained in her cell, but her heart no longer felt as heavy as before. Each day brought news from her lawyer, who visited often now, carrying updates and encouragement. He told her about the growing protests, about how her husband's speech had touched the hearts of thousands, about the investigation into the judge's record. He reminded her that she was not forgotten, that the world was waiting for her. Her husband, David, worked tirelessly. Every day, he spoke to the media, not with anger but with calm determination. He did not ask for special treatment, he asked for fairness. He reminded the public that his wife was not just his family but also a citizen who deserved justice like anyone else. His quiet strength and steady leadership won more people to their side. Even those who once doubted him now admired his honesty and courage. The pressure on Judge Harrison grew unbearable. Articles continued to expose his past cases, showing a troubling pattern of decisions that had hurt many families. Some of his old rulings were reopened. Lawyers who had once kept silent stepped forward to testify about his unfairness. The judge who once seemed untouchable now found himself standing on unsteady ground. His name, once spoken with fear, now carried shame. One morning, Angela was woken early by the sound of the cell door opening. A guard told her she had to get ready. Confused, she stood up, her heart racing. She wondered what this meant. Was it another hearing? Was it something worse? She dressed quickly, her hands trembling, and followed the guard down the long, quiet hallway. When she entered the courtroom, the air felt different from before. It wasn't filled with the heavy tension of earlier days but with a kind of expectant energy. The benches were packed with people, reporters, citizens, and supporters who had followed her story from the start. Her son was there too, his eyes wide with hope, sitting close to her husband. Seeing them made Angela's heart ache and heal all at once. The panel of officials sitting at the front began to speak. They explained that, after reviewing the evidence, after considering the lack of proof, and after hearing the concerns of the public, the judgment against Angela was overturned. Her sentence was dismissed. She was free. For a moment, Angela couldn't breathe. The words seemed too good to be true. She had imagined this moment so many times in her cell, but now that it was real, her body felt frozen. Then, slowly, the truth sank in. She was free. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned toward her husband and son. Her son leapt from his seat, running into her arms, sobbing into her chest. She held him tightly, kissing the top of his head, whispering again and again, "Mommy's here. Mommy's home." David came to her side, wrapping his arms around both of them. For the first time in weeks, the family was whole again. The courtroom erupted in applause, cheers, and tears. Reporters captured the moment, their cameras flashing as Angela clung to her family. Even the officials on the panel looked moved, their expressions softened by the sight of a mother reunited with her child. Outside the courthouse, a sea of people waited. When Angela stepped out with her husband and son, the crowd erupted into cheers. Strangers clapped, some cried, others chanted her name. Candles flickered in the late afternoon light, signs waved high above heads, and voices rose together in celebration. It was not just about Angela's freedom, it was about what her story had come to represent. Angela paused on the courthouse steps, holding her son's hand tightly. She looked at the crowd, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She raised her other hand in a small wave, her voice steady though soft as she said, "Thank you. Thank you for standing with me. Thank you for believing in the truth." Her husband stepped forward after her, his voice carrying strongly over the crowd. "This is not just a victory for my family," he said. "This is a victory for fairness, for justice, for every person who has ever felt unheard. We will not stop here. We will keep fighting to make sure what happened to Angela never happens again." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices echoing across the city streets. As the days passed, Angela adjusted to life outside prison. She returned home, where the familiar warmth of her kitchen and the sound of her son's laughter filled the air once more. Friends and neighbors visited, bringing food, flowers, and tears of joy. People who had once only greeted her politely now hugged her tightly, telling her how proud they were of her strength. But Angela did not see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a mother who had simply endured what she had to. Still, she knew that her story carried meaning beyond her own life. She began speaking at community gatherings, sharing her experience, reminding others that silence could allow injustice to grow, but voices raised together could change everything. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison faced the consequences of his actions. Investigations revealed years of unfair rulings, and eventually, he was removed from his position. The man who had once held so much power now found himself stripped of it, his reputation shattered. His fall served as a warning and a lesson that authority without fairness was nothing but a hollow shell. Angela's life was not the same as before, but in many ways, it was fuller. She cherished every small moment with her son, the way he laughed, the way he held her hand tightly when they walked to the park, the way he whispered at night, "I'm glad you're home, Mommy." She held on to her husband with deeper love, grateful for his courage and unshakable belief in her. Her home became a place of hope, a place where people came to talk, to share their own stories, and to find comfort. She listened, she encouraged, and she reminded them that no storm lasted forever. She carried her scars quietly, but she also carried her strength proudly. In the end, Angela's story was not just about a wrongful sentence. It was about resilience, about love, about the power of truth. It was about a community that refused to stay silent, about a husband who stood firm, and about a mother who never let despair break her spirit. One evening, as she sat on the porch with her family, watching the sun set in shades of gold and pink, Angela smiled softly. She thought of all she had endured, of the darkness and the light, of the pain and the healing. She knew the journey had changed her, but it had also strengthened her. Her son leaned against her shoulder, his small voice whispering, "Mommy, you're my hero." Angela kissed the top of his head, her eyes shining with gentle tears. "No, my love," she replied softly. "We are each other's heroes." And with that, she leaned back in her chair, holding her family close, her heart at peace. The world beyond her home still had many struggles, but within her walls, love and hope had already won.